The world is rapidly changing, but the law is failing to keep pace. More specifically, the ocean is changing in fundamental ways, and yet the law of the sea remains virtually unaltered in the last 50 years. This disconnect between the actual world and the world assumed by international law is especially visible and worrisome in the case of sea level rise. It's as if we built a fence over a pool of quicksand. It's not going to separate your yard from mine for very long. So what problems does this create, and what can we do about it? Coastlines have always fluctuated naturally. Through erosion and sediment deposition, they move. But the amount of coastal dynamism we're currently experiencing is unprecedented in modern human history. Coastlines are moving both inward towards the land and in many places outward into the sea. They're moving inward because the sea levels are rising. Although there is some local and regional variation, everywhere and in general, the seas are rising. There are two basic causes for this. Melting glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica are adding to the total amount of water in the oceans, while the ocean is also absorbing heat from the atmosphere, which causes its volume to expand. So as sea levels rise, coastlines retreat inward. But in many places, they're also moving outward. Dredging, which sucks up sand from one area and deposits it elsewhere onto a reef or a beach, is a very mature technology. And it's used every year by the Army Corps of Engineers and others to replenish and expand coastal areas. And it's even being used in places like the Persian Gulf and the South China Sea to construct entirely new islands where previously there were none. So coastlines are moving more than ever and more frequently than ever, and yet international law assumes that they always stay in the same place. The Law of the Sea Treaty is the main body of international law that governs the ocean. It determines who controls which parts of the sea and which boats can do what and where. It's often called the Constitution for the Oceans, and its negotiation in the 1970s and 80s was a really major international accomplishment. Most significantly, it creates zones of national control. 12 miles from the coastline is territorial sea, and 200 miles is exclusive economic zone. These areas give the coastal state, and by state I mean country, privileged access to resources like fish and fossil fuels. And it also allows coastal states like the United States to set and enforce the rules about which boats can do what in these areas. But the problem is there are two parts of the Law of the Sea Treaty that assume that coastlines stay in the same place. The first concerns what's called the baseline. It's the starting point from which you draw these 12 and 200-mile claims. And the treaty says the baseline is at the low water mark as shown on official charts produced by the coastal states. But the treaty is unclear about whether once the baseline is drawn, it's permanent, frozen in time. Or if in contrast, the chart needs to be periodically updated to reflect the new low water line and therefore the new baseline. So in other words, the baseline might stay put or it might change as the coastline changes. And if it does move with the coastline, then that means so too does the outer edge of that 200-mile claim. And we might be in a situation where areas are reverting from national control to a high seas status that's open access, kind of a free-for-all in terms of resources. The other area where the treaty assumes the coastline stays in the same place concerns the status of islands versus rocks. A rock is uninhabitable. It has no economic life of its own, but it still gets to generate a 12-mile territorial sea. An island gets that plus a 200-mile exclusive economic zone. So in general, it's better to have islands than rocks if you want to claim more maritime territory. But once again, the treaty is dangerously vague about the precise standards that differentiate a rock from an island. And more importantly, it says nothing about whether a rock can become an island or vice versa. The common issue here is change. When the ocean itself changes, does the legal status of islands or the coastline change too? The question may seem abstract, but it has very real consequences for a majority of the Earth's population. What happens legally as sea levels rise will impact our ability to achieve peace, stability, and sustainability in the century to come. There are two groups who are especially concerned about the status of islands versus rocks: those who are losing their islands to the rising seas, and those who are building entirely new islands. On one hand, small island developing states are worried about losing their land and their maritime territory. As the seas encroach upon those islands, they often become uninhabitable before they're entirely submerged, because salt water intrudes into freshwater deposits and onto croplands. And because these states are often made up of vast and far-flung archipelagos of hundreds, even thousands of islands, if even one island is reclassified as a rock, it could mean the loss of hundreds of thousands of square miles of maritime territory. On the other hand, there are states like China building new islands in part because they want to make new claims over maritime territory. For China, this is a matter of grand strategy, of increasing their influence and militarized control in the South China Sea. But for its Southeast Asian neighbors who are objecting to these claims, it's an issue of resource scarcity and food security, because China is using this island building to claim fisheries that were previously open for access by anyone who could get there. In terms of the coastline, the issue concerns situations where the 200-mile claims overlap, which is actually pretty common. In this case, the most typical response is to draw a line at the halfway point between baselines. But if the baseline changes, then so too does the halfway point. And this presents a situation where some states see an opportunity to claim new resources and throw out old agreements, where other states feel pressure to maintain existing claims and agreements. And anytime there's a valuable resource along that halfway point, whether it be fish or seabed minerals, fossil fuels, these will become subject to new rounds of resource competition and even potentially conflict. Finally, in terms of how we respond practically to sea level rise, our legal interpretation influences what we do. So if a coastal state is worried about losing maritime territory as the coastline moves inward, they will harden that coastline to defend its existing position. They'll put cement on the sand and build seawalls, levees, dikes, or they'll get trapped in a cycle of dredging, erosion. We know that these strategies are unsustainable and they're extremely expensive. But for a coastal state worried about losing maritime territory, this seems like the best option. Japan, for example, has spent millions of dollars since the late 1980s hardening the island of Okinotorishima because Japan says that this is an island. And the reason is that this single island generates 154,000 square miles of maritime territory. Now, China says that this is a rock, and its long-distance fishing fleets are encroaching on that territory, which they say is high seas. It's not exclusive economic zone. This clash of interpretations is likely to play out all over the world as coastlines retreat and islands are submerged, and areas seem up for grabs again in terms of resource claims. We must look to and prepare for the future, because the sea levels are rising whether or not we're ready for the consequences. And as the seas rise, so too does the legal uncertainty surrounding the status of islands and coastlines. We need to freeze the existing position of baselines and the status of islands and rocks. This is a solution that's been proposed by scholars since 1990, yet which has been generally ignored by policymakers and the public. If the international community froze existing claims today, we could mitigate the risk of resource conflict, do the right thing regarding small island developing states, and incentivize the best possible responses to sea level rise. In terms of resource conflict, the legal stability this interpretation would create would decrease the pressure felt by coastal states to militarize patrols in order to kick out fishing fleets from what they know is their maritime territory. For small island developing states, it's the right thing to guarantee their control over maritime territory, even if their islands become uninhabitable. This may give them a crucial bargaining chip as they're negotiating for new land and new citizenship when they inevitably have to relocate. It may also allow them to hold on to their status as independent states by connecting the people and the government to a territory, watery though it may be. In terms of practical responses to sea level rise, in most cases, it's a better option to have a moderate retreat of human civilization and infrastructure and allow coastal wetlands like marshes and mangroves to fill in. This strategy is cheaper, it's more sustainable, it sequesters carbon dioxide, and in terms of protecting the coastline from extreme weather events like the storm surges associated with hurricanes, it actually does a much better job. Now, you're probably thinking, this is all very interesting, but what am I supposed to do about it? The first and most important thing that we can do as U.S. citizens is lobby the U.S. Senate to ratify the Law of the Sea Treaty, which almost every other country in the world, except for the United States and a handful of others like Syria and Venezuela, has already done. Ratification would give us leverage over how the treaty is interpreted. In itself, the moment of ratification, because it's been long delayed, would provide an unparalleled leadership opportunity for the United States to forward the position that I've outlined here. It would also give us access to special courts that we could bring a case about this issue to and start building a body of jurisprudence that interprets the treaty in this way. If we do nothing, uncertainty is the best case scenario. More likely is that the status of islands, rocks, and coastlines will be understood as malleable in the legal sense, because that's the interpretation that China prefers and that they're implicitly forwarding in their island building activities and the locations where their long-distance fishing fleets are currently encroaching upon. So we don't know how much or how fast the sea levels will rise, and we don't know how permanent or prevalent artificial islands will be, or how much money we'll have to build seawalls 50 or 100 years from now. But uncertainty does not mean that we can't control our own fate. In terms of sea level rise, a little bit of concerted action and attention to the law of the sea, specifically to ratify and clarify it, will help us avoid the worst possible consequences and pursue the best possible responses to global sea level rise. Thank you.